Welcome to Truthful Manipulation. In a world where truth is bent, facts are framed, and influence is too often used without conscience, this podcast stands for something different. I'm Dave Kelsey, along with H. Daniel Mujahid, and together we expose manipulation, defend integrity, and help you see clearly in a world determined to confuse you. Tonight we're asking a question that cuts through the headlines, speeches, flags, press conferences, and all the polished language that usually comes wrapped around conflict. What's the real cost of a camouflaged war? Not just the military cost, not just the political cost, not just the price paid on a battlefield that most of us will never see with our own eyes. We're talking about the deeper cost, the cost paid in truth, in trust, in conscience, and in the moral health of a nation.
Yes, because a camouflage war is not simply a war with uniforms, ladies and gentlemen, missiles, drones, and maps. A camouflage war is also a war of framing, a war of omission, a war of managed perception. It is what happens when the public is shown just enough to react, but not enough to truly judge. And when that happens, people do not just lose information, they lose footing.
And once people lose their footing, manipulation gets easier. That's the point we want to dig into today, because history keeps showing us something that too many citizens learn too late. The war is not only fought where the bombs fall, it's also fought where the story is built.
That's strong right there, Dave. Because for the first shot, there's often a strip, But for the first deployment, there's often a mood being set. But for the first escalation, there's often language being softened, sharpened, repeated, polished, or distributed until the public begins to feel that the conclusion has already been made for them.
So as you listen today, don't just hear this as a conversation about foreign policy or statecraft or military strategy. Hear it as a conversation about human responsibility. Hear it as a conversation about whether citizens can still recognize camouflage when it's draped over truth. Hear it as conversations about whether a democracy can remain healthy if its people are emotionally moved faster than they are honestly informed.
And let's be clear from the start, we're not saying every war is camouflaged, but we are saying that danger becomes enormous when war is sold through selective truth or emotional shortcuts, simplification, or even strategic concealment. In those moments, the public is not being invited into moral clarity. The public is being steered.
Steered's the word, because when you're steered, you think you're moving on your own. You think you've arrived at a conclusion, and you think you chose it. But a manipulated path can still feel like a free walk. That's why camouflage works so well. It doesn't always look like a lie. Sometimes it looks like a partial truth presented with perfect timing.
And Dave and I, we believe that these partial truths can be more, dangerous than a full lie, because partial truth borrows trust from what is real, and then it uses that trust to hide what is not being shown to you. That's how good people really get carried further than they intend to go.
So today we're going to walk you through the cost layer by layer, the human cost, the truth cost, the trust cost, the moral cost, the financial cost, and the cultural cost. And by the end, we want you to leave with a better question than the one most people ask. Because the question's not only, can a war be justified? The deeper question is this war being presented honestly?
Let's start where every honest conversation about war has to start. Let's start with human life. Not as a statistic, not as a summary, not the rolling banner at the bottom of a screen. Human life. The mother holding a child while trying to look calm in a place where calm has already been taken away, you know? The father who leaves home and returns physically changed, mentally shattered, or never returning at all. The child whose sense of safety is cut out of the middle of life by a decision made in a room, probably somewhere far, far away.
And that's one of the most chilling realities of a camouflaged war. It can turn real people into abstractions. Once conflict is filtered through slogans, maps, and official language, it becomes easier for the public to stop seeing flesh and blood consequences. It becomes easier to talk in categories instead of in names. And it becomes easier to say casualties instead of sons, daughters, parents, neighbors, and classmates.
Once human beings become categories, conscience starts to dull. That's the danger. A camouflage war does not merely hide information, it can hide the face of suffering from the people whose support is being requested.
Think about how often the public's handed a neat phrase: collateral damage, necessary action, strategic strike, regional stability. Those words may be technically tidy, but tidy language can cover a torn apart reality. A destroyed home is not tidy. A family fleeing with what they can carry is not tidy. A veteran waking up months later hearing sounds that are no longer there is not tidy.
And this is where moral imagination matters. The public has to work to keep human beings visible. Especially when institutions start speaking in abstractions. Because the minute people stop seeing the person inside the policy, manipulation has already won some ground.
And the suffering doesn't stop when the cameras leave, Daniel. The trauma can stay for decades. Children can carry fear into adulthood. Entire communities can become defined by loss. Families can inherit silence. And veterans come home and discover the hardest part is not what happened over there, but the loneliness of trying to explain it here.
So when someone asks the cost of war, the first honest answer is this: the cost is paid in lives, but also in futures, in nervous systems, in family structures, in memories, in trust between generations, in the invisible wounds people learn to hide because the world keeps moving as if the damage ended when they stopped shooting.
That's why camouflaged war is especially dangerous. It can get the public to consent to suffering without fully confronting it. It can make the pain feel distant, selective, and somehow clean. But war's never clean. And when it's sold as clean, the public has already been distanced from the truth of the blood price.
I'm gonna let that sit for a second, Dave. Once citizens are separated from the reality of what war does to human beings, they can be moved by narrative faster than by conscience. And when this happens, the culture itself becomes easier to harden.
So before we ever discuss grand strategy, we need to ask a more human question. Who will carry the cost in their body, in their sleep, in their family, in their future? Because somebody always will. The question is whether we're being honest enough to say that out loud before the price comes due. This is Dave from Truthful Manipulation. If today's conversation's hitting home, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode with someone who still believes truth matters, integrity matters, and moral clarity matters. And if you want to go deeper, pick up our book, Truthful Manipulation, A Roadmap to Live By. It's built to help you recognize the methods, the language, the pressure points manipulation uses on the human mind. The book and the podcast are here for one reason: to help people see clearly, stand firmly, when the world keeps trying to blur the lines. And now, back to the show. Now let us go deeper, because the next price of a camouflage war is not only what happens to the bodies, it's what happens to truth. When truth is bent in order to sell conflict, the damage rarely stays confined to the conflict itself.
Right. Once leaders, institutions, media systems, or influence networks learn that truth can be trimmed or staged or even rationed to move the public, they do not suddenly forget that lesson later. They carry that method into everything else. It'll pop up in election laws, in the culture, in the laws, in our educational systems, in the public safety, the public good, in concepts and talks about race, religion, economics. War becomes the proving ground for a broader habit of managing truths.
And that's why words matter. Listen carefully anytime public language starts sounding emotionally loaded but morally unexplained, necessary, urgent, protective, defensive, preemptive, stabilizing. Those words may or may not be accurate in any given situation, but they can also become camouflage. They can create the feeling of clarity without the substance of clarity.
And when people start feeling that way, feeling like they understand, then they often stop pressing. That's the psychological opening, you know? If language can create enough emotional confidence, many listeners will not go to the next step. They won't ask, what exactly is being claimed? What evidence is supported here? Or what is being omitted? What competing facts are being softened? And who benefits from the phrasing?
That's a huge point. Camouflage in language doesn't always scream. Sometimes it's smooth. It turns normal complexity into a manageable slogan. It lets citizens feel aligned before they are fully informed. And once the public is emotionally aligned, dissent can be painted as weakness, disloyalty, or even a threat.
Yeah, which means the battle over truth quickly becomes a battle over permission, doesn't it? Permission to question, permission to slow down, permission to refuse emotional coercion, permission to say, I hear the urgency, but I still need honesty.
That kind of courage matters, Daniel, because in moments of pressure, one of the first things that gets attacked is careful thought. The systems begin rewarding speed over wisdom, outrage over reflection, repetition over evidence. That's not an accident. That's how public philosophy gets managed.
And managed truth always carries a long trail and a long tail. If a population later discovers that claims were overstated, or that evidence was selective, or that motives were mixed, or costs were hidden, then the damage does not stop with embarrassment. It becomes a breach. It becomes a fracture in the relationship between the public and the institutions that ask for trust.
And once truth is treated like a flexible tool instead of a moral obligation, people begin adapting in dangerous ways. Some become cynical and believe nothing. Others become tribal and only believe what flatters their side. Both reactions are understandable, both reactions are destructive, and both make future manipulation easier.
People who trust nothing can be exhausted, even into a passive state. And the people who trust only their tribe can be activated into aggression. In both cases, manipulation still has room to work in.
Daniel, we saw that happen on January 6th when we saw the tribe get activated into aggression. And that's why we keep coming back to this phrase. When truth becomes flexible, citizens become vulnerable. A healthy society doesn't merely need information, it needs trustworthy information delivered with enough completeness and humanity for people to exercise judgment.
That humility, that's something that does. I think Bernie Sanders would call that huge right there, Dave. Honest leadership leaves room for complexity. It does not pretend certainty where certainty doesn't exist. It doesn't perform righteousness to cover confusion. It doesn't use emotional force to rush people past the evidence. A camouflage war does the opposite. It tries to make scrutiny feel like sabotage.
So if you want to know whether camouflage might be at work, watch the language. Watch what gets repeated. Watch what facts feel lit up and which facts feel dimmed. Watch whether the public's being invited to think or merely being instructed to feel.
And when the truth gets bent, the next thing to crack, is trust. And trust, once it's broken, it's a very expensive thing for a nation to try to rebuild it.
That's because people remember the feeling of being handled. They may not remember every document, every briefing, every timeline, every argument, but they remember the feeling that something was packaged for them. They remember the sense that they were pushed towards a conclusion. They remember the shock that comes when later facts make the original certainty look thinner than advertised.
Now, at this point, that's really when the haunting questions start. What were we told? What were we not told? Who knew more than they admitted? When did they know? When was it? Who framed the story? Who profited? Who paid? And once these questions are settled into your culture, ladies and gentlemen, they do not stay contained to one conflict. They start bleeding into every institution connected to the event.
And you get two dangerous outcomes. One is corrosive cynicism. Nothing is true. Everyone lies. All institutions are performance. The other is hardened loyalty. I do not care what the facts are. I'm staying with my side. Both feel protective. Neither produces wisdom.
Yeah, both create instability, don't they?
Yes.
A cynical public is difficult to unite around. Worthy causes become assumptions about pills to manipulate. A tribal public is easy to mobilize but hard to reason with, because it measures truth by allegiance.
Which means truth's not a soft issue. It's a civic infrastructure. A society needs enough shared confidence and basic truth-telling to make decisions together. Without that, everything comes more combustible. Every crisis gets harder. Every disagreement gets messier. Every institution gets viewed through suspicion or blind devotion.
So the real price of a camouflage war is not just that people may be misled in the moment. It's probably that the culture becomes less able to believe anything responsibly after the fact.
Exactly. And that's why accountability matters so much. If public institutions ask for truth in the name of life and death decisions, then they owe the public extraordinary honesty, extraordinary transparency where possible, and extraordinary seriousness about correction when they get it wrong. Without that, truth keeps bleeding out.
Let's face it, a trust our public can be manipulated in opposite directions at the same time, Dave. One message can inflame fear, another can inflame despair. One message can say, follow us immediately. Another can say, nothing is worth believing. Both of these weaken democratic judgment.
So here's the punchline for this section. Once a war is camouflaged, the lie doesn't die when the fighting slows down. The lie keeps building the future through weakened trust.
That line needs to be heard and heard again, Dave, because the bill comes due later, in public fragmentation, in institutional fatigue, in civil anger, in generations that inherit confusion instead of clarity. You are listening to Truthful Manipulation. We do not do surface level conversation here. We go after the language underneath the language, the motives underneath the message, and the moral costs underneath the headlines. If you value conversations that challenge, spin, and call people back to integrity, follow the podcast, Truthful Manipulation. Share the episodes. Invite somebody else into the discussion. Because the stronger the manipulation, the stronger our awareness has to be. And now back to the show.
Now we come to what may be the deepest cost of all, moral injury. Not only the moral injury carried by the people who fight, witness, survive, or lose loved ones, but also the moral injury that can spread through the public when people discovered they supported something without being given the full truth needed to judge it ethically.
And that's such a critical distinction, Dave. Because when citizens are emotionally moved into support and later realize the picture was partial, distorted, or strategically staged, they don't just feel misinformed. Many feel used. Some will feel ashamed. Some feel angry. Some become numb. Some can't even name what happened, but they know something inside them no longer sits the same.
And when a culture accumulates enough of that, moral clarity starts to erode. People stop asking, is this right? And start asking, which side benefits? Which message wins? Which story protects my team? This is a very dangerous exchange because once conscience is displayed by strategy, the public square becomes easier to harden and easier to manipulate.
A camouflage war can train people to accept ethical compromise, and call it maturity. It can whisper that skepticism is naive, that moral hesitation is weakness, that urgency excuses concealment, and that if the cause sounds noble enough, the process doesn't need to be cleaned at all.
But process matters, means matter, truth matters, integrity matters. And when a society starts acting as though the emotional power of a cause cancels the duty of honesty, It's building a culture that can be mobilized by appearance instead of anchored by principle.
And this is where the language of conscience has to return in America. Citizens need moral vocabulary strong enough to resist the seduction of strategic dishonesty. We have to be able to say, I don't care how urgent the case sounds if honesty is being rationed. I don't care how noble the branding feels if the human cost is being hidden. I don't care how powerful the rhetoric becomes if scrutiny is being treated like betrayal.
That's not disloyal. That's moral adulthood. Real maturity is not the ability to repeat the line under pressure. Real maturity is the ability to remain human while pressure's being applied.
And that remains one of the biggest tests in public life. Can we, the people, keep our consciousness engaged when the crowd wants speed? Can we, the people, protect our integrity when fear, grief, outrage, and belonging are all being activated at once?
But make no mistake, the public can suffer moral injury too. Maybe not the same form as the soldier or the survivor, but in a civic form, a cultural form, a conscience form. A people can feel degraded by what is consented to under incomplete light.
And that's why the healing side of this conversation matters too. A healthier society has to make room for honest reflection, honest correction, even honest grief, honest humility. If not, the wounds get buried and turns into cynicism, rage, denial, or numbness.
So here's the hard truth. A society can recover from loss faster than it can recover from normalization of dishonesty in matters of life and death.
That's it right there, Dave. Because once people become comfortable with ethical fog, future fog gets easier to deploy. There is another price that the public often sees too narrowly here, Dave, and that's the financial cost. Yeah, war costs money. That part is obvious. But the deeper question is not only how much gets spent, the deeper question is what gets abandoned while that spending escalates.
That's right. Every large conflict, every prolonged escalation, every heavily militarized response carries an opportunity cost. Money directed into destruction, force projection, emergency systems, private contracts, reconstruction, and long-term care is money not directed somewhere else. And that somewhere else matters.
It matters in schools that remain under-resourced, in mental health systems stretched too thin, in our neighborhood still waiting for repair, in healthcare people cannot afford, in infrastructure that continues to decay, in public programs that could strengthen resilience at home but remain underfunded while the language of necessity keeps flowing.
And when a war is camouflaged, the financial redirection can feel morally untouchable because it's been wrapped in urgency. Citizens may be told sacrifice is necessary, but they're not always shown the full ledger of what else is being sacrificed at the same time.
Exactly. Camouflage in this area does not merely hide violence. It can also hide priorities. It can hide who benefits economically. It can hide which sectors grow stronger. It can hide which communities are quietly asked to keep waiting. Because the nation has accepted that war claims first call on attention and budget.
And the civic effect is huge. When a population becomes accustomed to permanent emergency framing, it can lose the ability to think in long-term moral investment. Short-term threat can keep outranking long-term repair, and that's a dangerous habit for any democracy.
Yeah, because the democracies need more than defense. They need health, they need trust, they need education, they need functioning communities, they need citizens to feel that the nation is building something worth defending, not merely asking them to fear something worth fighting for.
And yeah, money matters, but dollars are not the only story. The deeper issue is whether camouflage conflict is draining a country while telling the people that they're being strengthened. That's how a nation can be hollowed out from the inside, while the public still being handed language about safety, honor, and necessity.
And once again, the practical question becomes, are citizens seeing the whole trade-off, or only the portion of the ledger that makes consent easier?
If you believe these conversations should reach beyond the usual noise, help us push them further. Follow Truthful Manipulation, share the episode, and pass our book, Truthful Manipulation, A Roadmap to Live By, to someone who's tired of spin dressed up as truth. We built this platform for people who want awareness with integrity, people who still believe clarity is worth fighting for. Stay with us. The strongest part of today's conversation is still ahead. And now, back to the show. Now we reach the layer that may outlast all the rest, the conditioning of the public mind. Because each time a war is sold through fear, moral oversimplification, emotional repetition, and selective truth, the public learns a lesson, and it's not a healthy one.
And that lesson is this: slogans can outrun scrutiny. Urgency can outrun evidence. Repetition can outrun reasoning. Imagery can outrun moral complexity. And once that lesson is absorbed deeply enough, the next manipulation requires less force.
And that's how camouflage becomes cultural. Doesn't stay attached to the one event. It becomes a template, a mood, a reflex. Citizens begin to respond to emotional patterning before they examine claims. Audience begin to equate confidence with credibility and speed with truth.
And the next generation is always watching. Young people are learning what power sounds like when it is hiding something. They are learning whether public persuasion has to be ethical or whether manipulation is simply how serious people operate. They are learning whether questioning is courageous or punishable.
If a culture keeps teaching that urgency excuses transparency, then it's training future citizens to accept concealment as normal. And that's devastating, because a people trained to expect manipulation often stop resisting it. Some surrender, some mimic it, some weaponize it from their own side, but all of that deepens the damage.
And that's why awareness is not enough by itself. Awareness must be joined to integrity. You can recognize techniques and still decide to use them yourself or not. What matters is whether truth remains a boundary, whether honesty remains a discipline, whether conscience remains active even when pressure is high.
And that takes practice. It takes patience. It takes refusing to be rushed into certainty. It takes asking, what's missing? Who benefits? Why this wording? Why this timing? Why this image? Why this emotional trigger? What happens if I slow down and demand a fuller picture?
Now, these are protective questions. They are not cynical questions. They are responsible questions. A democracy needs citizens who can ask them without being shamed for asking.
Because once a public loses the ability to distinguish information from orchestration, it becomes easier to steer not only in its policies, but its feelings, its loyalties, its fears, its moral boundaries. That's not informed citizenship. That's managed consent.
And managed consent is one of the most dangerous forms of public weakness because it often feels patriotic while it's happening. So the question becomes, what do we do? How does an ordinary citizen resist the fog without becoming numb, paranoid, or overwhelmed?
First, slow the frame down. When a message arrives wrapped in urgency, ask what urgency is doing to your ability to think. Strong emotion's not a proof. Repetition's not proof. Consensus theater's not proof. A confident voice is not proof.
Second, look for what is absent, not only what is present. What voices are missing? What costs are minimized? What timelines are unclear? What definitions are doing too much of the work? Or which human beings have disappeared behind categories?
And third, separate loyalty from honesty. Real loyalty to a nation, a people, or a moral cause doesn't require blindness. In fact, the more serious the stakes, the greater the responsibility to tell the truth cleanly. Truth's not the enemy of solidarity. Truth's what keeps solidarity from becoming manipulation.
Fourth, keep conscious engaged. Do not let the crowd do your moral thinking for you. Don't let fear suspend your ethical vocabulary. Don't let strategy replace humanity. Ask yourself not only, does this sound effective? Ask, does this sound honest? Does this preserve human dignity?
Fifth, resist the temptation to become what you're criticizing. This is huge. People can become angry at the manipulation. They start justifying manipulation methods for their own side. That's not resistance. That's replication. And replication guarantees the cycle continues.
And six, we'll finish with this one. Build communities where careful thought is still possible in your neighborhoods, you know. Talk to people who can reason without screaming. Read widely. Check language. Make room for complexity. Support leaders and voices that treat citizens like moral adults, not emotional targets.
The last point matters because no one resists camouflage alone forever. People need each other. They need spaces where asking better questions is respected, not mocked. They need reminders that slowing down can be an act of courage.
So, yes, the forces that shape public perception can be powerful. But we, the people, we are not helpless. A public that learns to pause, to question, to compare, to humanize, and to hold truth above emotional performance is far harder to manipulate.
And when that kind of public grows, camouflage starts losing power. It can't survive as easily when people insist on seeing the full outline of what's being hidden. So let's bring it home. What's the real cost of a camouflage war? Is it the loss of life? Is it damage to bodies, families, and futures? Is it the bending of truth? Is it the weakening of trust? Is it the injury to conscience? Is it the theft of resources? Is it the conditioning of the public mind?
And by the time the camouflage is removed, much of that price has already been paid. That's why the work of citizens, journalists, leaders, teachers, preachers, parents, and neighbors cannot begin after the damage. It has to begin when the story is first being built.
Because the battlefield may be far away, but the manipulation starts much closer. It starts in language, in timing, in framing, in selective emphasis, in emotional pressure, in the shaping of what people feel permitted to say, question, fear, and support.
So don't only ask whether a war can be justified, ask whether it is being presented honestly. Ask whether human cost is being shown fully. Ask whether the language is clarifying or concealing. Ask whether urgency is making moral adults out of the public or emotional instruments out of them.
And remember this line, because it's the heartbeat of today's episode. The most dangerous wars are not only the ones fought with weapons, they're also the ones sold under cover.
If we want a healthier country, a stronger democracy, and a more honorable public square, then we have to reject camouflage wherever it shows up. Not just in war, politics, or media, or business, but in personal life. Anywhere language is being used to hide the truth rather than reveal it is a flag.
And that's the call. See clearly, speak honestly, hold the line where conscience is trying to be negotiated away, and never mistake polished presentation for moral legitimacy.
Because when camouflage becomes normal, truth becomes optional. And when truth becomes optional, freedom gets weaker.
Thank you for listening to Truthful Manipulation this week. Be sure to share this episode, keep the conversation going, and above all, keep your integrity awake. Comment on this week's episode at truthfulmanipulation@gmail.com. Don't forget to pick up a copy of our book, Truthful Manipulation, A Roadmap to Live By. It'll help you see these manipulations clearly. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe at truthfulmanipulation.com. We want to thank everybody for coming out to the King's Rally this weekend, and stay focused on taking America forward. Thank you very much for listening this week.